Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to introduce today our speaker from postdoc career seminars, Dr. Chandrabali Ghose. Dr. Chandra has Ph.D. and is the founder and CEO in bioharmony therapeutics and early-stage biotech startup, specializing in development of novel antimicrobials to combat drug-resistant bacterial infections. Chandra spent 8 years at the Aaron Diamond Eyes Research Center, affiliated to Rockefeller University, where she focused her research on developing life-saving vaccines. Prior to that, Chandra was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Medical School in the Division of Infectious Disease. And Chandra has published high-impact peer-reviewed articles and book chapters in the field of infectious disease and has received many awards for her scientific career and contributions that include New York University, the Infectious Disease Society of America, Prelude to More Global Challenge, and the Mid-Atlantic BioAngels for Speed. She has volunteered her time at the CDF Foundation, NAI's Next Mentoring Program, and that Pew Charitable Trust Program of Super Moms Against Superbugs to raise awareness about antibiotic resistance, a cause she is passionate about. Chandra earned her PhD from New York University, School of Medicine in Microbiology, and her bachelor's degree from St. Louis University in Biology and Theology, splitting her time between Missouri and Spain campus. Chandra is a fellow of the 4th class of Health Innovators Fellowship and a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. So Chandra gonna share with us her experience as research and start as well.
Sure.
A company, and it's gonna be real informal. Please ask questions, any questions. Yeah, Chandra is with you.
Thank you so much, Felipe, for inviting me to chat with your colleagues today. I don't have any slides. I thought this would be, more of an informal discussion, like an Ask Me Anything kind of forum, where I can share with you guys my journey, where I started from, where I am, hopefully where I'll end up, I don't know. And, maybe you can pick up, some, if there's any advice I can give you, I would be happy to, and I would really ask you guys to ask me questions or interrupt me as we move along, as I tell you a little bit more about myself. So like Felipe mentioned, so I'll start from the very beginning. I grew up in Calcutta, India. I had a great childhood. I was always loved my school. I went to an all-girls school. I fell in love with biology in about 9th or 10th grade because I had an awesome teacher. And to my parents' consternation, I actually veered towards biology more than math because my whole family is full of engineers and actuaries. And to them, biology was a little bit scary because it was a little bit had blood and gore and bacteria and viruses. And so they were not at all excited at that point. For my undergraduate work, I applied. It was very strange how all of this came about. A lot of my friends in high school were studying to go abroad. So we would go to the U.S. Embassy to take, they would go to the U.S. Embassy. They had an educational room where they would practice for their SATs and the TOEFLs and so on and so forth. And obviously, the U.S. Embassy had a beautiful library. So even though I had no intentions of going to the U.S. at that point, I used to go with them to actually study in the beautiful library. And because I had to register on some form, this is again, in the 1990s. So it's before, where, you sign a form right now, you're going to get, bombarded with, lots of spam, if you will. At that point, we actually used to get postcards in the mail from different universities. So one of the postcards that I got, and I thought it was so interesting, was St. Louis University, which is in Missouri, had actually had a campus in Madrid, Spain. And that was the first year that they were looking to branch out and kind of include international students to that campus. So far, most of the students that they got, 20 or 30 per year, they used to come from the main campus. They used to transfer over for a semester or so to learn Spanish, kind of do their European, backpacking, for a semester or two, and then go back. And they wanted to change that a little bit and broaden the scope where, someone like me, who's an international student, would come there, do their first couple of years of undergrad, and then transferred to the main campus to graduate. And so, as they say, rest is history. I kind of applied for this just on a whim, and I got in and convinced actually my grandmom to let me go. And she convinced my parents, and I ended up, living in Spain for a couple of years and then transferring to the main campus in St. Louis and graduating. But throughout my whole undergraduate work, I was very, I really liked biology, like I had mentioned. And this was the first time I started doing any research work. And again, all the labs that I joined, the lab that I was super attracted to was working on salmonella and diarrheal illnesses. Again, something that, as someone who grew up in Calcutta, we were always told, don't drink tap water, boil your water, this, that. And, very... I've seen up close and person what huge differences vaccines and antibiotics and so on and so forth made. And so that was my first sort of toe dipping into the research world. And I really enjoyed myself. And so once I graduated, I applied, or during the process, I applied to grad school. And I came to NYU basically because I loved, I loved New York. I loved, and NYU at that point, and even probably still is one of the few universities in New York that has a micro department. So that was also.
I think that you mentioned that because the parasitology was created by women, Brazilian scientists.
Rosenzweig.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's true.
Rosenzweig, who worked on malaria and almost got a Nobel Prize for it. Yeah.
Yes.
And so NYU had a history of having this really famous parasitology department, had a really strong microbiology department. They are affiliated with Bellevue. So historically, a lot of the HIV cases, were identified there, a lot of TB cases. So it's, because again, Ellis Island was here. So if you think about the history of America, the history of infectious disease in New York being, one of the big cities, where a lot of people kind of live together.
Like a hubby, yeah.
Yeah. So so it was a super interesting, department. I joined the Department of Micro. My lab worked on H. pylori, which is a bacteria that causes, or is I wouldn't say causes, but correlated with gastric cancer. And that was my first foray into learning actually the balance between good and bad bacteria. It was super interesting to even think about bacteria from a good lens, right? And this is again before the whole, the importance of microbiome, etc., was even kind of
was not a hot field, yeah.
Yeah. So so that was I was there for 5 years. I did. It was a great experience. And I always say my first publication was my best publication, and everything has been downhill since then. Because the first one was actually in the PNAS, and the rest have been like normal micro.
That was a good beginning.
That was, and I thought like that would be, it's like I said, it's all downhill from there. And, after I finished my PhD, I moved to Boston. I joined the Department of Infectious Disease at Mass General Hospital as a postdoc at Harvard Medical School. And it was again, fascinating. Mass General is very well known. It's, a world-class institution. Their ID department is obviously fantastic. Like our current CDC director used to be the head of, the Department of ID there. And the lab that I joined was run by Dr. Ed Ryan. And again, the reason why I joined his lab was because he had the whole department had a very close relationship with the Institute of Diarrheal Illnesses that was based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. We used to get a lot of students, postdocs, scientists, if you will, who used to travel from Dhaka and work in these labs and go back. And, so we were working on actually a cholera vaccine. And again, stuff that I was always very interested in. And while we were working on that, it so happened, because Mass General is a hospital, even though it's an infectious disease lab, working on research, they all mostly all of the PIs there were MDs who were in the ID department. And at that point, there was an outbreak, one of the first ones in the US of C. diff infection. And we kind of saw it firsthand how an outbreak happens, how you diagnose things, because the path lab was on the same floor as our lab. So it was super exciting, super interesting, kind of seeing something that, you know, is happening, you know, in real time, and how, you know, how do you react to it, right, at an institution like MGH. And again, Cambridge is the head, you know, the center of biotech today, but, you know, this is, again, 17 years ago, where, you know, once the, you know, outbreak happened, one of the things we wanted to look at was, you know, with this C. diff infection, like, is there a vaccine that works against it? And in Cambridge, at that point, there was a small biotech startup, and it was my first foray into kind of translational research, where we actually worked with this company to look at, so again, you know, anything that's in the GI tract, your mucosal immune response. We know so much about vaccines right now, right? Your mucosal immune response is so important. Most of the vaccines are given, you know, intramuscularly, etc. But would it do anything to the bacteria in the gut, right? How big is a role that your mucosal immune response play was kind of my project. So we looked at that, looked at, you know, like how, you know, a biotech actually develops, you know, their vaccine. And it was super interesting and super exciting at the same time. And then after my postdoc, I moved back to New York because I wanted to live in New York, and was very interested in vaccine work, again, still interested in infectious diseases. And I joined the Aaron Diamond AIDS Research Center, where I met you. Yes. And I joined David Ho's lab, who is absolutely like a fantastic scientist, fantastic doctor. He's been at the forefront of HIV work for, you know, since the beginning of HIV. And he's this Magic Johnson's doctor, you know, and he was, you know, he started Aaron Diamond AIDS Research Center back at the height of the HIV epidemic in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And he was one of the first scientists. Like, pretty much everything we know about HIV research has come out from Aaron Diamond, like the co-receptors, you know, what is antiretroviral therapy, combination therapy. In fact, a lot of the scientists who are working on COVID, for example, they've all kind of wet their toes in the HIV space. Like, if you, especially you see Fauci, HIV scientist, right? So there was a lot of things that was learned in the HIV space that, you know, has translated, like, you know, into, like, you know, multiple, like, you know, viral pandemics, bacterial, immunology, oncology. There's a lot of immunology that goes into studying HIV because of the chronic nature.
Yes, it's like, it's a whole, after HIV, like, everything, like, was affected for good. It's true. Because I can think, like, imagine, like, a situation like now without HIV could be even worse. That's really
yeah. So a lot of, like, for example, scientists, how they are studying, you know, like, we can't just throw around coronavirus in the lab and test stuff. So it's pseudotype viruses, right? Yes. Which is like the basic reagent every scientist, grad student, postdoc would make in a lab to study HIV. You know, so like little things like, you know, reagents and, like, you know, things like that, like, you know, which we take for granted, you know, kind of came from that HIV space. So it's super, like, you know, it's very interesting to see where the field has gone, and, you know, so on and so forth. So, so I initially started as a postdoc in David's lab. You know, I worked on HIV, but I still continued working on my C. diff project, and we got an R01 grant. So I kind of moved more into the C. diff world. And, you know, we developed vaccines that were different from the small biotech that, you know, that I had collaborated with in Boston, that eventually got acquired by Sanofi. So very, very translational work where, you know, a lot of the science we did in the lab, we had to do it with the lens towards how would that translate into patients? Like, you know, it would be great to have a vaccine that needs only one shot, but can that be translated into actually being meaningful in patients? What if you had the most amazing vaccine that needed 4 shots, right? Like, you know, how hard would that be to, like, you know, deploy, you know, in large scale? So a lot of, like, those kind of questions that, you know, as a scientist, I wasn't trained to answer was kind of on the forefront of Aaron Diamond, in the lab that I was at. And so I was there initially as a postdoc. I got promoted to research scientist. And as I was doing my work, there are very few bacteriology labs very few bacteriology labs at Rockefeller. So the one that, I worked closely with in the animal rooms was Vince Fischetti's lab, and they were developing novel antimicrobials by kind of exploiting bacteriophage bacteria evolution. So one of the things I would like, my 2 cents, if there's anything you guys want to get from me, is like biology never lies. So it's like the main tenet. Like if you're trying to like screw around with biology, it's always going to come and bite you in the back. So antibiotics have changed life as we know it since like the discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming almost like 100 years ago. But one of the things to keep in mind is that most of the small molecule antibiotics that we've probably all taken have all been discovered from other bacteria, other fungi, etc. So, and these are usually made as ways for the host bacteria to protect and, clear out their niche and kind of have its own nutrients as a way of warding off other bacteria. So if you think of antibiotics from an evolutionary point of view, other bacteria are going to come up with ways of evading that because that's kind of what they've done for millions of years, right?
Biology.
Who's, who has been at Rockefeller right now, maybe for like more than 50 years, wanted to see if you exploit phages, which is like, if you think of the food chain, it's on the top of all our food chains pretty much. Like you have viruses that infect bacteria, that infect humans, and so on and so forth. So these viruses are known as bacteriophages because they infect bacteria. And when they infect these bacteria in the last stage of their lytic life cycle, when they have a ton of progeny phages that need to come out of the bacteria, they make this molecule called lysins that basically rips up the cell wall and kills the bacteria. And then the progeny phages come out and they continue and kind of go on and infect other host cells. And so there's no bacteria that's alive in the world that has ever seen a lysin molecule. So there's no way for them to come up with a way to develop resistance to these molecules. So that was the tenet of or the hypothesis that Fischetti had, and kind of went with it to see if you could use these molecules as therapeutics. Could you address the whole question of multi-drug resistant infections, which is rampant now? A lot of the molecules, like we need like 4th, 5th generation drugs to overcome resistance because, bacteria develop multiple different ways of evading these mechanisms. So that was sort of the main tenet of, or the technology that we used to form BioHarmony Therapeutics. We started in 2016, again, straight out of...
Like, how was this? Was like a natural pathway, like, okay, you saw like that, or have a potential that maybe should move forward, not just to stay in the academia, and how was like that?
So David Hofer is a very prolific guy when it comes to science as well as startups.
Yes, it's true.
He has like, like if you look him up, he's been involved with so many companies that are now like billion-dollar companies. Like you think of Gilead's of the world, of like Brie Biosciences, ViiV, GSK. He's been involved in developing drugs for 30 years. And so in his head, like, it's a natural progression of like kind of teaching his postdocs and students to kind of go like, there are many academic scientists who kind of love academia. And I was one of them. I loved academia. I loved writing my R01s. I loved my postdocs. I loved my students. And I would have been happy like staying there. But he thought like it would be good for me to kind of venture into that space. So there was a little bit of nudging that it got involved. Before I started BioHarmony, I actually worked in a different startup for about 9 months to see if I like talking to investors, if I like developing drugs, because drug development is a whole different...
It's a different world, It's like...
And so I worked in this company called Symbiotic Health, they were already working on C. diff, so I at least knew the science really well. And I wanted to see if I could pick up the business, like there are 10 things you need in a slide if you're going to form a company. You need to know the problem you're solving, how you're solving, how much it's going to cost, and how much money you're going to make the investors. So they're very basic things that investors want to see. And if there's a way for you to wrap your head around that and address those from a monetary point of view, startup world is for you. And so I joined Symbiotic Health. I really liked the world of VCs, etc. And I thought I could actually do something in this space. And I knew this technology was in Vince's lab. And I also had a relationship with the tech transfer office. It's very important for you guys to have a good relationship with the tech transfer office, whether it's for your own IP, intellectual property, or whether at some point you want them to be a partner in allowing you to take some technology and form a company around it, right? So that's kind of the backstory of BioHarmony. So I had support from Vince Fischetti, who I knew for many years. I knew the tech transfer office for many years. New York City at that point was just starting to kind of get into the biotech, startup space. Obviously, Boston and San Francisco are the big two hubs. Yes. New York City really isn't. And so they were quite happy. I wouldn't say quite happy. They were okay with their own academic scientists kind of starting a company with their support. So, I needed all of those different things to work out.
It was like a good moment, and a good time, like the environment was...
Yeah, it was the right moment and the right technology and the right people involved that, allowed me to do this. And I was also fortunate because the other component of all of this is money. And antimicrobials, everybody uses them. They cost pennies. Pharmaceutical companies don't want to develop them because you can't charge a lot of money. And so most venture capitalists and investors don't want to go into this space, even though there's a huge need, is because pharma is not going to buy you out. So what you do, once you spend all this money developing a drug, it takes $1 billion to develop a drug, you can't make that money back, right? So it's almost like, when they tell you if you have a market, you can develop anything, that's always not true. The market in this case would be the pricing of the drugs. So I was very fortunate to meet an early stage investor. His name was Chris Garabedian. He's, if you guys have any ideas or company formation ideas, he's a very great resource to look into. He runs, if you want to get into the biotech space, one of the really interesting hour of your week could be listening to Biotech Clubhouse on Clubhouse on Sundays. It's 4 p.m. Eastern. It's basically an overview of everything that's happened in the biotech world that week.
Okay,
so they get like the that. Yeah. So it's on Clubhouse. It's called Biotech Clubhouse, and I would suggest you guys join that. Whether you start your own company, you decide to join biotech, you'll get like the news and views of that week, and you get to actually see pretty much like the heads of all biotech companies that you can ever think of come on that and talk about, whatever it is that has happened that week. So it's a really interesting resource to have. So that's one thing. And so we got investments from them. We got a pharma partnership going. We did everything we could in the book to get money to move our product forward. And then, we decided, at this point, we are, and you're constantly looking for money. So we are still fundraising. It's always about money. And we're also doing some really great research. We are looking at folks who might want to buy some of our assets and, give us enough funds to move some of the other assets forward. So it's really an exciting time because you can think of different ways of doing deals that I had never thought of, different structures to move, your company forward, and so on and so forth. So sometimes, like when I think back, like even 5 years ago, about how terrified I was about like the business world, what I can tell you guys is that there's nothing there that you can't learn. So if there's something that you're willing to work for, there's nothing in that space that should be scary, should be shocking or anything like that. There's also lots of online resources like classes that are free, that are run by many institutions, etc., that kind of teach you how to even start a company, what to look for, what intellectual property even is, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of where I am. So I'll stop right now. If you guys have any questions for me, any specific questions, any questions about your careers or your research that I could help with, feel free to ask, because the next half an hour is for you guys.
Let's see if they have some question. One question right now, which products do you have in the pipeline?
Which product?
Yes.
So it's really funny, like it's not funny, but before COVID, we had pivoted to developing an inhaled lysine to treat pneumonia in ventilated patients. And so, and then COVID happened and tons of patients got ventilated. And so it kind of made sense to kind of stay that course. Yes. That's probably that's our most advanced asset, which is we are developing a lysine to treat pneumonia in ventilated patients.
And Chandra, like I said, because you come from India, I come from Brazil, and I know like that is a different perspective. I compare people like in countries like USA or Europe. How do you think that background impact your career?
So, I mean, my interest in infectious disease obviously was kind of fed by, some of the things I saw, like, I've had cholera, I've had typhoid.
Yes.
So for me, like it wasn't so much a natural fit, but I was attracted to that space. So I don't think, again, it's whatever you're interested. There are plenty of, my colleagues from, my hometown who are in oncology, who are, what I would say is like, it doesn't matter so much what your background is. It's like, as long as you do something that you're super passionate about, right? And then it doesn't seem like work.
Yes.
I think that's important. Like you find something that you're very passionate about, because then, learning about it doesn't seem, like it's, sometimes it feels like a grind, but it doesn't always. So.
Yeah. Some questions?
Oops, sorry.
Don't worry. And Chandra, for like, that's something for me, like, that's like, I'm more afraid, like when you think, how is the first talk like to talk the investors? Because we don't have training for that. Yeah, like we're not in the business, like, it's like really like, wow, how was like you prepared for that? Or
so one of the ways you guys can, because we're in the virtual world, which is, obviously has its good and bad. So for example, it might be too late now, but there are lots of pitch competitions that happen like, universities hold it, different pharmaceutical companies have them, where you can go and actually see what a successful pitch looks like. And they're usually 10 minutes. So, and then it's a competition. So you see what the best person had, and, what they talked about and what that hook was that attracted the investors to them. There's always, a 30-second elevator pitch. There's a 1-minute elevator pitch. There's a 5-minute pitch. There's a 10-minute deck. There's a half-an-hour deck. There's an hour deck. After that, no one wants to listen to you. So an hour is probably the most.
Most. And like when you decide to this move, like probably because like I said, in New York was like a great time because they are starting invest more, because generally like we think generally like in San Francisco or in Boston. Do you think like sometimes it's important you move like to the city, or even like you are like in a small university or in a small city?
No, because I think the funny thing is that VCs are now expanding, right? Because they know, like, that technology comes from everywhere, right? So if there's a good technology in a small town, they will find you, as long as they know that, you're looking, like, you go kind of looking for them as well. And one of the things you have to realize is that it's the VC's job to find technology. So they are looking for you to come find.
They are looking for it.
Yeah. So in general, they will all look at your slides and say no, maybe like 99 out of 100 will say no, but they will look at it because that's literally their job.
Yeah, that's intense because like here in Colorado, we are not like the hot place for that, but it's true like that I mean, 3 years now, almost 3 years, and they can see like that's increasing, even like, whoa. And there's some place that in the beginning I couldn't even thought about that, you know. That's true, but I think that things like we are sometimes like as postdoc or even graduated too focused on that it seems so far, you know, like to start. But it's interesting just saying that even because they sound like okay, or you just do research, you know, and you even think about okay, maybe I can translate that, but it's so far, so it seems so distant for us, like. But it's interesting to say like that, like, okay, there are people looking for that. We have to be more open-minded. That's the interest.
Yeah. So so just keep an open mind. Like, you know, people are looking for stuff, and you know, each state has its economic development corporation kind of funds that each university has. So for sure, each university system will have a tech transfer office. And they will have their favorite VCs, programming. So if this is something you guys are interested in, that's the first stop. If it's a big enough university which has like an MBA kind of business program, that's another stop. If there's a medical school, for sure they have a tech transfer office. You know, so there's many resources that are present. There's even probably small grants, internal grants they might have that can help you kind of translate. Like if you have something, you know, that looks really good in vitro, you want to see whether, you know, in a mouse model or whatever, you know, whatever animal model, you know, you can show some in vivo efficacy, that's even better. And you can try and get that funding, you know, to take it to that next stage, right? And so on and so forth. So it's all little small steps, you know, like look for the resources that are in the universe. There's always one PI that's highly translational, right? Like ask them, like, you know, to see if they've, you know, what experience they have, and so on and so forth. So there's a question that came in from Alex. How important was it for your career to go beyond a postdoc position within academia? So when I was finishing my postdoc, I actually did 2 postdocs. So I did my 2 years in Boston, and then I moved back to New York. And then I did about 3 or 4 years as a postdoc in David Ho's lab before I got the R01 grant, which kind of got me the promotion for research scientist. And like I said, I'd be happy still being in academia. I didn't know what was out there. And if that push hadn't come, I would have probably stayed in academia. So sometimes I think back and I think sometimes when I look at jobs and I look at people who, you know, like when VCs see somebody and they think, okay, we're going to give them a big pot of money. Yes. What are some of the characteristics that they kind of look for, right? They'll say a lot of things like, you know, you're a research scientist, I want to make you into an entrepreneur. All of that is great. There are a couple of things that they all seem to want. And I don't know how much of this is important or not, but since you asked me the question, I'm going to give you the answer, what I've seen at least. They look for consultants. So management consulting, whether in Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey, those kind of positions are something that they look for some reason, as well as some pharma experience. So, but pharma experience can also be like, you know, you don't have to go to big pharma, but it could also be as, you know, in a smaller biotech, because there are biotechs that are like, I mean, Moderna is as big as many of the other pharma companies, right, at this point. So, and it's a small biotech. So, you know, there's obviously some experience that, you know, people look for if you're going to be a super successful like CEO, but that comes later. So if you're interested in biotech, either start your own company, do some management consulting if you want, work in a biotech, you know, look at tech transfer. There's so many options really out there. And this is a really good time to be in biotech, by the way. There's so much money in biotech.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and right now, do you think like, even with the COVID, I have a feeling that it's really terrible what's happening, but I have a feeling that it's good for for the scientists. It's good for show for the world, like, okay, even for investments, okay, we have, it's important what we do, you can move with that. I don't know if it's feeling, or what do you think about that? Do you think it's like a,
I mean, it's a good time for biotech because it can, I mean, it shows what biotech can accomplish, right? Like one side, you know, even if you think about Pfizer, the research came from BioNTech, which is
yes,
a small biotech company, right? And Moderna, again, you know, very well funded, but small biotech company till they kind of, you know, both of these kind of went around and tried to save the world, right? So even though they've all partnered up with, not all, but like at least BioNTech has partnered with large pharma, it's still, you know, people now realize like how important tech is, right? Like biotech is, science is, I hope. You know, so it's a good time to be, I've always thought it was a good time to be in biotech or in biology since I was 16 years old when I made that decision. So now it's too late for me to change to anything anymore. So.
Okay, let's see if you have more questions here. I don't think so. Well, Chandra, thank you very much for your time. Was really interesting and to know like more about
I don't mind sharing my email if
I'm gonna say if you can.
You know, I'll put it in the chat, and if you guys have any questions that you don't want to ask in this group, but if you want to send me an email, yeah. So you know, I'd be happy to address those as well.
Yeah. Thank you guys for joining us. The next week you're gonna have like a postdoc seminars that's gonna be announced. And again, thank you very much, Chandra, for sharing your experience. Was a pleasure.
Yep. Take care, guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye.